Hello and the warmest of welcomes to your local part of the show, just of course for the North East and Cumbria. And coming up on the programme this week, trade unionists take to the street to protest new laws which they say will prevent legitimate strikes. But are they right to be concerned? Well, that's one of the questions I'll certainly be asking my guests, who are the Gateshead Labour MP Ian Mearns, Tyneside Conservative Duncan Croot and Phillip Broughton from UKIP. Welcome to all three of you. But let's start with the political row that's blown up over the cash which our local councils will be, or probably actually won't be, getting to run services in the North East and Cumbria. A £300 million government relief fund designed to help areas hardest hit by budget cuts has gone mostly to councils in the south of England. And the likes of Newcastle, Durham, Sunderland, Middlesbrough will get nothing, although Northumberland and Cumbria can expect to benefit from some extra help for rural areas. Well, the North Durham Labour MP Kevin Jones has described the allocation of the money to councils as blatantly political. Duncan Croot, it does seem that way, isn't it? When you can think that Conservative councils in Oxfordshire, Surrey, Hampshire, all getting a big slice of this money, yet councils here in the poorest part of the country not getting anything. Pretty cynical.
Well, first of all, good morning, Richard. Thank you for having me on. Good morning to Ian, to Philip and to all the viewers. It isn't at all. One thing I want to get straight is that this Conservative government spends more money per head on public spending in the north of England than it does in the south. We spend currently in the northeast of England £9,756 per person. In the southeast we spend £7,776. So there's nearly an £1,800 discrepancy.
And you know the reasons for that is because unemployment's higher here, deprivation is higher here. And yet when it comes to this emergency fund, because councils across the North East are facing big cuts again, it seems to be those southern Conservative shires that get the help and not the councils in the North East.
That's not true. We've given £6 million to Newcastle City Council to help them build social housing. We've given £5 million to Sunderland City Council to help build an international advanced business park on top of the £80 million we gave to them to build a much needed new bridge across the River Wear. Greg Clark, who's the Community Secretary, and his ministers carried out the most comprehensive review that has ever occurred. 278 local authorities were consulted.
I'll have to move it on to, you're saying it's a fair deal for this region.
Okay, if I come back, can I just finish?
I need to put those points
Sure.
to Ian Mearns. I will come back to you. But yeah, per head of population, Ian Mearns, the North East is still getting more help than those councils in the south.
That's because, you know, when council tax was introduced after the abolition of the poll tax in the early 90s, we all breathed a sigh of relief. But it was established with a Band D median for collection of taxes. And of course, in the north east of England, councils like my own, over 60% of the properties are in Band A. Therefore, an unfair burden falls onto people in modest houses on modest incomes to collect those taxes. Of course, in the southeast of England, places like Surrey, people are paying less in Band D properties on council tax than they're paying in Band A properties.
But you wouldn't deny the figure that Duncan Croot used, which is overall more money goes per head of population on public services here than it does in the south.
That's money which is coming directly from central government, but we actually have to raise a higher proportion from people on modest incomes through council tax here in the north.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to council tax. Phillip Broughton, I'm sure UKIP activists in the south might welcome the extra help that's going to councils there. Is it unfair, though?
I think this is a government that doesn't really care about the North East at all, and I think we've got to take a step back and think, well, why are we in this mess to start off with? The fact is the national debt has doubled under this useless Tory government. It was just over £800 billion 5 years ago. It's now £1.6 trillion. That's £10,000 of debt for every man, woman and child in this country. The government is making a mess of the economy.
Okay, all right.
And what we're saying in UKIP is we've got to prioritise frontline services, our NHS, our armed forces and the police.
How are you going to do that?
Well, we've got to make cuts. And the cuts that we would be making, because we think Labour and the Conservatives are both wrong, is we've got to cut things like the Barnett formula, where we could save £5 billion. We're saying we'd cut the foreign aid budget by £10 billion. That's going to go up by another £4 billion over the next 5 years. And also we're saying let's scrap that HS2 line. £60 billion we're going to waste on that. Right. That's not going to help the North East.
OK, all right. Well, it won't help councils immediately, but OK, fair enough. Duncan Croot, I mean, the other thing that occurs to people, this is very handy, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, Labour councils are going to have to make these cuts, etc. Quite suits a Conservative agenda to say, oh, look, it's your Labour council that's doing this, not us.
Well, I wanted to come back to the point earlier about what Greg Clark had done. We'd identified that obviously business rates are going to be received by the councils. That's part of the policy that we're going to implement. it's pretty obvious that businesses are located in urban and city centre locations. They're not located in rural areas. And what was identified, the rural areas were worried about this transitional period, so that the grant has gone predominantly to the rural areas, like Northumberland is a good example, who's received 4.8 million.
Eamon, isn't this a political cycle, though, really, effectively, that Labour put the funding up for urban councils when it was in power? You live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Well, I think when you see a £300 million fund being distributed in such a partial way, with 114 million pounds alone going to the 8 shire counties directly around London, all of which are Tory controlled, quite frankly, it is partial and it's political, the way in which it's been distributed. On top of that, by the way, the redistribution of business rates will actually be detrimental to the northeast of England down the line.
We're going to continue to talk about council funding, because the latest funding round just adds fuel, of course, to the fire over cuts that are happening. Labour-run local authorities say they'll have to cut jobs, close libraries, daycare centres, even museums to balance their books. While many of us could see council tax increases of almost 4%. Conservatives insist, though, efficiencies and spending less on management could deliver savings. Luke Walton reports from Darlington.
We say fight back, they say cut back.
Protesters on the march in Darlington. They say the council's plans to cut millions from spending threatens not just jobs, but the whole character of the town. And this is one of the services they're defending. The 130-year-old Crown Street Library is one of two in the town, along with the mobile library earmarked for closure, to the horror of campaigners.
Well, the building itself is important. Look at it, it's a wonderful building. But what's really important to us is what happens in this building. The access to information, the access to books, the computers are used by people applying for jobs, benefits, those kind of things. Community groups meet here, and we remain to be convinced that closing 2 libraries, including this one, and the mobile library service, and replacing it with something in a sports centre, we just remain to be convinced that that's the right way. These buildings should be retained, they're so important.
It's not the only Victorian icon with an uncertain future. The council also wants to sell off the town's covered market if traders can't afford to take it over. But a growing petition suggests shoppers and stallholders don't agree.
I fear that it would be upgraded to a shopping mall type thing, and we would lose the identity of a market. The smaller traders probably wouldn't be able to afford the rents in the place, and you would lose the atmosphere of a market.
The threat hanging over this market has generated real anger, but the debate about council cuts touches on much deeper questions about what local authorities should do and how it should be paid for. In another corner of town, cuts of a different sort are being enjoyed by residents of this supported housing scheme for the elderly. The local Labour leader says essential services like these for the vulnerable have to be the priority.
While our grant has gone down, we've been hit with a perfect storm because we've seen a massive increase in the cost of adult social care. And so we're getting hit with less wages and more expenditure in household terms, and it means that we're in a pretty dire place.
But while Labour accused Conservative ministers of unfair funding of the region, local Tory councillors say opportunities for efficiency are still being missed.
They are failing to work across the piece, to work with other local authorities to make savings, certainly in senior management positions, and I think that that's something that we should be really encouraging them to do.
What's clear is that with council tax increasing, the question of value for money looms ever larger. Darlington and Cumbria councils are among those proposing a 3.99% rise, which includes 2% ring fence for social care, while Newcastle and Hartlepool plan a slightly lower 3.9% increase, also including that 2% precept. The prospect of more for less leaves some unhappy.
If anything, it should be reduced by half, because I mean other services are reduced by half, so why pay full council tax?
They say because government funding's been cut.
Yeah, well,
is it all the government's fault, or is it the council as well?
Well, it's the council as well, isn't it? Yeah, I think they just use it as an excuse as well, like.
Is it the council's to blame for that, or the government?
Yeah, well, this is it. It's like 6 of one and half a dozen another, isn't it, really?
How to buy the essentials when money is a stretch. A conundrum for shoppers and increasingly for local government too.
Luke Walton reporting. Ian Mearns, I mean, the problem here is what some of those people in Darlington said, isn't it? Because Labour councils say they've got no money, etc. But a lot of people don't believe that all the efficiencies have been looked at before they start cutting services and closing things.
I think what the problem is, though, Richard, an awful lot of people don't actually see the services which are being provided. A huge amount of the proportion of council spending goes on relatively few people through adult social care for the disabled, for the elderly, for the most vulnerable. The problem we've got is if the government reduced revenue support grant to nil by the end of this Parliament, we'll actually have a situation in Gateshead. We've done the mapping, we've done the financial mapping already, where if we cut 100% of every other service, 100% of everything, we'll still have to make cuts in adult social care and in children's services to balance the books.
Duncan Crook, that's the point, isn't it? It's just ridiculous to talk about efficiencies. I mean, Newcastle Council's faced a 60% cut in the last 6 years. Durham's will have to have saved £153 million by 2020. It's just ludicrous to talk about efficiencies. These are huge cuts that you can't do anything about other than cut services.
Well, I'm talking about the case study they've done with Darlington. There were 53 executives on that council who earn more than Ian's salary of £74,000 as an MP. The chief executive is one of the highest paid chief executives in the north of England. They earn more than £150,000 per annum, okay? And yet they're going to lay off 186 people. Just hear me out, Richard.
There may be some money to save for that, but to be honest with you, even if they cut their salaries by half, it would not do anything to stave off the kind of cuts that Ian Mearns was talking about.
Well, I was on the side of Unison in June of 2014, where these executives gave themselves massive pay rises, yet they expected the bin men to take pay cuts. And Bill Dixon, the leader of the council, defended this action.
But you're not suggesting, are you, that just by cutting the pay of this is a solution to the problem? That's the point, isn't it?
Well, the council, what I have read into it, needs to save £46 million over a 10-year period based on a gross income of £228 million. If these executives drop the pay to 35k, which is still a very good salary,
it's going to save £46 million, is it?
It's going to save £3 million per annum and would probably have saved 186 job redundancies.
Okay, right. Phillip Broughton, if UKIP was in control of these councils, would you put council tax up or cut services further? Labour councils, I suppose, saying they find themselves between the devil and the deep blue sea.
We are a low tax party. We want to see council tax as low as it can be. The question is, what do you actually cut? Now, we've been saying you should be cutting things like the councillor allowances, you should be cutting the massive six-figure salaries of chief executives of councils. No, but these things count, though, Richard. These things count.
But it doesn't tackle 60% cuts in budget to Newcastle, £153 million that County Durham gets. Even if you stop paying all the council employees virtually, you wouldn't achieve that.
Let's just look at Darlington for a minute, and I have done a little bit of research on this. They actually have a debt of £151 million. Now, the debt interest payments on that alone is 4.1 million. That's a lot of money that they could save. That's a lot of money that they could save. And my point is, the Conservatives have doubled the national debt, and locally Labour are increasing debt as well.
Okay. Ian Mearns, Labour have complained about this obviously for 6 years in this region, but never once has Labour proposed reversing any of these cuts.
Well, that's quite true, and I regret that, frankly. I think we're actually in a situation where George Osborne's imposing these cuts on local government in the northeast of England, but finds it perfectly OK to increase the pay of his own special advisors by 42%. It's one set of standards for one set of people and one set of standards for another set of people. And frankly, I think it's actually drawing money out of the regional economy, which is actually having a very, very bad effect, because this is people's wages that they spend in shops and goes around in the local economy.
Duncan Crook, briefly, this 2% that councils are going to be able to raise to fund adult social care, it raises peanuts. In places like Newcastle, £1.7 million, when they say they need £15 million. It's just a red herring again, isn't it?
Well, I'll give you the Newcastle case, £602 million in the red. The interest payments alone are nearly £22 million per annum. We suggested, through the electoral commission, to take the number of councillors down from 78 to 56. It's been poo-pooed by the Labour Council. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to spend £45 million on refurbishing the Civic Centre.
OK, all right.
So I think there's certainly cuts they can make.
OK, all right. We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, for the moment. So we're going to move on to another subject. Now, there's been a week of protests in the region against the government's trade union bill. Ministers say the new laws will ensure industrial action only takes place when there's genuine support for it among members, ending any chance that a handful of workers could call a strike. But Labour believes it's an all-out attack on the movement. So what's proposed? Well, in future, there will have to be a minimum of 50% turnout on a strike ballot. And to go ahead, strikes in the public sector will need the support of at least 40% of those who take part. And unions will have to give 14 days' notice of any strike. And the so-called check-off system for collecting union subscriptions direct from an employee's salary will end. All that, of course, helped fuel this week's protests. A show of strength by trade unions in Newcastle, but also an attempt to win public support for their fight against a bill they think will undermine workers' rights.
I think that's going to open the door to let, employers take advantage of vulnerable workers and to be able to implement changes in the workplace, unfair terms and conditions, restrictions on pay that ultimately is going to divide the country further.
It's a long-standing vendetta against the trade unions going back to the 70s with the Tory government, and they feel they're in a position now where they can attack the trade unions.
If we're going to have levels of participation in ballots, then I think that should apply to all ballots, and we should be looking at the government as well, because if we need to have a particular level to take industrial action, maybe they need to have a particular level to actually rule us.
And trade union leaders do see the measures as vindictive.
Industrial action is at an all-time low, so there's no business case or rationale for attacking workers in this way. And we've got real concerns that the trade union bill is going to shift the balance of power. If a workplace goes through all of the rigmarole, meets the thresholds, employers will be able to bring in agency workers now to break that strike action, which has been banned since 1973.
But people will look at this and say, well, this is just the unions wanting all the power in their hands. They want to be able to call a strike action on 10-15% of members turning out. They want to shut down businesses that want to keep on trading by using those agency workers. It's just the unions wanting to be over mighty, isn't it?
If you bring agency workers in to break industrial action, how are those agency workers going to feel? But let's think about the health and safety implications of that as well. This trade union bill is being set out to silence the very people who might have something to say about the cuts to essential public services and the cuts to their terms and conditions. That's what this is about.
Public support may help the unions, but what they really need now is to persuade the House of Lords to wreck the bill. Duncan Crew. It's payback time. It's all about you muzzling the power of the trade unions.
Absolutely not. This is in our manifesto. It's been voted on and we're implementing this as law. And I really don't know what the fuss is about. What we're saying is that all the union members have to be balloted. They have to have a 50% attendance. It has to be a time frame of 4 months. It has to be a recent action, not something that's going back 2 or 3 years ago. And it's a 40% threshold. So basically, whoever gets to 40%, they still have the industrial action. There's also laws in here, Richard, that are protecting those union members, right, who don't want industrial action, who have had confrontation in the past. They are being protected. It's actually cementing the rights of the unions, the right to strike. The point,
there's a bit of hypocrisy here. Apparently, it's democracy's okay when it's 12-15% people turning out to vote for a police crime commissioner. Apparently, it's not democratic for union members below, kind of 40% of their membership to vote for strike action.
Well, this is the problem we've had in the past. Strike action occur where this hasn't happened.
But
they've just gone ahead.
Democracy works like that. Why doesn't strikes work?
Well, it's still a low turnout. You're talking 50% turnout, and if they win 40% of the threshold, they can take industrial action.
OK, Ian Mearns, people do face disruption when public services like schools, hospitals, railways are affected by strikes. It's perfectly reasonable, isn't it, to say 40% of those taking part must have voted for that strike action?
Well, I think the most recent one is the doctors' dispute where 98%.
Well, you know that's not the case in many strikes.
But the thing is, what I'm saying, Richard, is there are good examples and bad examples, and I think the problem we have is, and Beth Farhat was exactly right. What is the problem that this bill is trying to sort out in industrial relations terms? The level of disruption from strikes at the moment is at an all-time low. So what is the problem that the legislation is trying to sort out? Another part of the bill, though, is about the infringement of unions to actually collect political funds.
Doesn't that just place a burden on unions to engage with their members more? They've just got to persuade them to give their subs in. They've got to get to the members that don't usually vote in ballots and persuade them to vote. It could be energising for unions to actually engage with people who are not the most ardent activists.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It's always right for unions to engage with their members, but I mean, in terms of actually restricting an agreement between a union and an employer to check off the subs of the members, what is the problem that's trying to sort out?
Phillip Broughton, isn't it good for democracy that trade unions are allowed to raise money, workers effectively to support a political party? Because that seems to be the attack here, perhaps, that the Labour funding will suffer because of this, while parties like yours, parties like the Conservatives, can still get big cheques from business.
Look, I think trade unions do a very, very important job in protecting workers from bad employers, but I think it's got to be a balance. You know, we've got to make sure that we have a fair deal for the employee and a fair deal for the employer.
And that's why we supported this bill, isn't it?
Yes, we think this threshold is a good thing. But I do want to come back to what we were talking about earlier on, because, you know, at the end of the day, in these local elections in a couple of months' time, you've got a choice. Now, we've got two people here.
I don't want to have a bit of electioneering. Let's talk about the trade union bill. It's got a quite tough message, isn't it, to sell to union members in the North East who you like to support you in those local elections. Yeah. We support this bill restricting, you know, your right to strike.
No, we're not restricting the right to strike. We agree with the right to strike. People should have it's a basic right to strike, but it's bringing democratic processes into this and saying, look, it's up to the union members to be able to make this decision, and a threshold has got to be a good thing. But I say, though, there's no difference between Labour and the Conservatives. It's more tax, it's more spending, more borrowing, or it's prioritising frontline services.
We'll have plenty of time to get that in selection. Duncan Croot, briefly, if I could say to you, you know, the actual attack here is on the Labour Party, isn't it? Undermine union funding, undermine the Labour Party, anti-democratic.
No, far from it. There are lots and lots and lots of union members who do not vote Labour. They vote Conservative, they vote Green, they vote Liberal Democrat, they vote UKIP.
It's highly politically convenient, though, isn't it, that if union funding falls?
We're adopting the same principle that's existed since the 1920s in Northern Ireland, where they have an opt-in to donate to the Labour Party.
Richard, I think it's really interesting how crossbenchers in the House of Lords totally disagree with what's just been said.
Well, we'll see what the House of Lords makes of that in the coming weeks. Now, plenty more news this week, including the final word on those controversial red doors in Middlesbrough. Here's Luke again with our regular weekly roundup in 60 seconds.